especially as we see this race develop. We don't really know if she's going to get indicted, but if she does, what happens? Will the party establishment endorse Bernie Sanders? We don't know. As we move on, it's going to be very interesting. So let's move on to the Republican primaries now. Big news, Marco Rubio suspends his campaign after losing his home state of Florida to Donald Trump. The percentages weren't even close. Donald Trump swept Florida. He also took North Carolina, Missouri, and Illinois. Big news, Ohio, John Kasich took his home state, which is that last dying breath that the Republican Party can rally behind as they all try to get Donald Trump to either refuse the candidacy or try to get him to finally collapse under his own comments. We don't know what's going to happen with that. So this question is prevalent in the media, it's prevalent in every single political discussion. The Republican establishment does not like Donald Trump. If Donald Trump does not get the necessary delegate count for the Republicans, which is 1237, it goes to a second ballot, which will be a brokered convention. Anybody can win, anybody can be the nominee. How likely is it that a brokered convention will happen on the Republican side?
Well, I think it seems extremely likely right now that that's where the Republican Party is going. But they can't ignore the fact that Trump seems to resonate with the voters in an emotional way that especially John Kasich and Ted Cruz have not been able to do in wide sweeps. And I think that's because it speaks to the anger that a lot of these voters are having with the economy and situations right now. But one of the things that I'll say is, although the Republican establishment might not like Donald Trump, they cannot deny him the nomination if he does have a significant margin going in. Because Republican voters would just vote the other way, or not vote at all.
Do you really think they're going to vote for Hillary, though, if she's on the other side, or write-in, independent
There's
candidate?
a lot of Republicans who are not ecstatic about Donald Trump. So I don't think they would vote at all, if that was the case.
I think that's more likely. I mean, you're not going to see any Republicans go out and vote for Hillary Clinton because they probably dislike her even more than they dislike him, if that's possible. Now, in order for Donald Trump to get the 1,237 delegates that he needs to secure the nomination before the convention, he would need to win 58% of the remaining delegates left in the Republican primaries. And at this point, it's looking fairly unlikely that he's going to be able to do that, given that he seems to top out around 40 to 45% of the vote in most states. With Ted Cruz and John Kasich still in the race, I don't think that Trump's going to be able to get to that number. However, if he is close, if he's just a little bit short, it would be extremely hard for the Republican establishment to deny him the nomination that so many people came out in droves to give him. You cannot, I don't think, shut out completely the voice of the voters of your party just because you are not happy with the candidate that they chose.
I think the RNC is really regretting them underestimating Trump and the power he's had so far. And we already see how uncomfortable they are right now with this situation. So it'll be interesting to see how they react if he does end up getting the number of delegates necessary.
Just to give you the picture again, Davis alluded that Donald Trump would need 58% of the remaining delegates. Remaining, we have 1,061. Trump currently has 673, Cruz 411, and Kasich 143. Obviously, Kasich is far behind Cruz and Trump, but maybe he can get some momentum from Ohio. Did this Ohio victory mean anything for Kasich? Can he move on? Is this a viable pathway for him, or is it just, well, it was his home state, what do you expect?
Well, what John Kasich is hoping for by winning Ohio is that he will have enough delegates to stay in the election until the convention, and in the case of the brokered convention, he could likely be the Republican establishment's choice for the nomination. And in my personal opinion, he would be the best candidate for the Republicans in the general election. He would by far have the best chance of beating Hillary Clinton, assuming that she is the nominee. However, I think that there's a perspective to look at this from where John Kasich winning Ohio actually helps Donald Trump going forward as opposed to hurting him. Because, as I mentioned earlier, Trump tops out at about 40 to 45% of the vote at most in a lot of the states that he's won. The only way that the Republicans will be able to beat him and keep him from getting the number of delegates that he needs or getting another candidate, Ted Cruz, to get more delegates is if this is a two-man race. The longer that John Kasich is in and it's a more crowded field, the more votes are being taken away from Cruz, and the less and less likely it is that the Republicans will be able to stop Trump before the convention.
I'm glad you bring up Cruz because he's in the middle of this. He's not really establishment, but at the same time, he's really a true outsider. He's taking votes away from Kasich, but he's also taking votes away from Trump. Can the Republican Party as a solid unit overtake Trump at all, as long as Cruz is in the picture?
I think that Cruz at this point seems to be the only candidate that would be able to take the nomination from Trump reasonably. That's the only candidate that the Republican Party could really put forward as a candidate that actually had potential to beat Trump. Looking at polls, Kasich would actually be better against Clinton, beating her in at least a 3-point margin according to Fox News. But Cruz, on the other hand, still in some cases seems to be overtaking Clinton as well, versus Trump is astronomically losing according to polls.
And just to have it as reference, these polls are derived from Real Clear Politics. They compile these polls ranging from Fox News, NBC News, ABC News, Quinnipiac polls. Really, if you look at Cruz's situation, Republican senators, his fellow Republican senators, they don't like him. The establishment, they don't like him. Democrats don't like him, obviously. Is it really that much better if Cruz wins for the Republicans? Is Cruz actually somebody, because you mentioned that they could get behind him, but can they actually get behind him? Because there's a lot of division. And even as Cruz is there, do you think they can still launch another candidate, an independent solidarity ticket?
Well, I think this goes back to what we were seeing in this whole election as a whole, and the fact that the Republican establishment, for what it used to be, has pretty much disintegrated at this point. You have Ted Cruz, who is largely the Tea Party candidate, and then you have Kasich, who in some way you could call, the traditional establishment candidate at this point, but to say that Kasich is the Republican establishment candidate is such a far margin from what it was maybe 4 or 8 years ago. He was a little bit more extreme in those ends too, especially when you look into his views on Planned Parenthood and other such things.
Cruz may not be as big of an outsider as Trump, obviously. He's far from the establishment candidate, as well as Kasich. And the RNC lost their 2 establishment candidates, Jeb and Marco Rubio. So I don't necessarily think they would concede with accepting Cruz as the nominee, but I think they would take him over Trump any day.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, because if you look at Ted Cruz, one thing that you cannot argue is Ted Cruz is a conservative. There is no questioning that. He represents the conservative movement that Marco Rubio always talks about. He represents all of the conservative values that are associated with the right wing. Donald Trump, however, does not. He might be running on the Republican side, but Donald Trump, he's only a Republican in name. When it comes to a lot of issues, he's very moderate, and he's even very left-leaning on some issues, but he's running on a conservative social platform to be able to skid by on the Republican ticket. Because, if you look at some foreign policy, for example, Trump's an isolationist, which is completely the opposite of the alignment of most of the Republican Party, who are very hawkish and they are pro-intervention in the Middle East. Trump, on the other hand, is not. Trump has come out in support of a single-payer healthcare system before. That's a socialism idealist policy. That's something that Bernie Sanders supports. So Trump does not represent the conservative base at all. So I think that the Republican establishment would be willing to throw their support behind Cruz, because he does embody their conservative